So I'm grateful. I will be away from January to the end of March, and I do plan to come back. Everybody keeps asking me that, so there you go. It's settled. I plan to return. My family and I love it here, and it's hard to believe that I've been at Lakeview for 8 years. I have been incredibly blessed by this community, this staff team that I work with, and in particular, the pastoral team that I'm a part of. And, it's kind of funny to look back over 8 years and to think of all the different ministry leaders that I've been able to serve alongside during my time here at Lakeview. So you can actually look for yourself at the different pastors, ministry leaders that I've served alongside over the past 8 years. And I'm sure you see some familiar faces, maybe faces you haven't seen for a while. Probably for some of you, there are faces you don't even recognize, people who served at Lakeview before your time. And it's incredible the amount of wonderful people that you can meet in 8 short years. But consider that this church is over 100 years old. How many pastors have served this community? And I found this document in our archives, and let me just read something for you. For context, the first location of our church was on the Smith Block on Broadway Avenue up until 1928. And this document says, in 1928, a church building was built on the corner of Main Street and Eastlake Avenue, with Deaconess Edith Sutherland continuing to serve as supply pastor. And then it goes on to list all the ministers who served as pastors from 1929 to 1964. And, maybe you've seen this kind of thing in old churches, like a roster of all the ministers who've served in a parish. Here's one from Holy Trinity Parish in Orange, Australia. And you can see that the names start with King A. Smythe in 1857, which is kind of cool. Or this one from St. John sub Castro in East Sussex, London. It's a little hard to see, but if you zoom in, you can see that the names start with Edward Sandwich in 1559. That's a great name. I love that one. 1559, and all the ministers up until current time. Last one, from the Windermere Parish in St. Martin's Anglican Church in Cumbria, England. Again, zooming in, you can see that the list of rectors dates back to 1256 with, get this, Patrick DeMann. Oh my word. Sometimes the internet just pulls through, and it's the greatest thing ever. And I don't know what comes to mind for you when you see these long lists of ministers. When I think of the long line of pastors who've served this church for 100 plus years, personally, I'm grateful to be part of the rich history of this faith community. But I also find it humbling because it is a reminder to me that none of us are permanent. Even though I do plan to return for my sabbatical for a very long stretch of service here at Lakeview, I will not be here forever. None of us will. And today, as we spend time listening to Hebrews together, I think this idea is going to come through clearly. And I hope it will be helpful for each of us to accept the fact that no pastor, minister, reverend, priest will last forever. But that's okay. Because the scriptures tell us that we have a high priest who is unlike any other name on any of those lists that hang on church walls. And if you're new to Lakeview or you haven't been around for a while, are in the middle of a teaching series on a book in the Bible, a letter called Hebrews. And so far what we have discovered is that the pastor who wrote this letter has been trying to encourage the church he's writing to look back in order to help pull them forward. To look back to the story of their people, to retrace the actions of God throughout history, and to understand what God has always been working towards in order to pull their attention fully towards what God was trying to do in their time. And we believe the scriptures spoke to those original audiences, but the scriptures also speak to us today. We also want to look back, to locate ourselves in the grand story of God in order to help us look forward and to anticipate what God is up to in our time in our church. And one of the resources that we regularly lean on here is called the Bible Project. if you're not familiar with the Bible Project, I highly encourage you to check out their website, their smartphone app. Their tools, their videos are incredible, and they really help bring the Bible to life. And in their summary of the book of Hebrews, they suggest, hey buddy, that there are two main goals to the whole book. First is to elevate Jesus as superior to the angels, greater than Moses, elevated over the law, and as we will see today, greater than any human priest. And second, the pastor wants to challenge the reader to remain faithful despite the persecution that they are facing. And we're in a very different situation than the first century Christians, but I want us to receive that challenge this morning to remain faithful. So I invite you to pay attention to those themes this morning. And I also want to just echo the welcome from the others. I just want to say, I love having the kids in junior high in the room today. It's great that you are here. If you didn't grab an activity sheet, we have those in the back. And you can follow along for some of the buzzwords that I'm saying. And you can find me after the service, kiddos. Bring your activity sheets, and I'll give you a little prize. So, in today's passage, the author of Hebrews is going to compare Jesus to the Jewish priesthood. And the author is writing to a group of people who would have been very familiar with the priestly system. So it's important to name a few things that are probably not common knowledge for all of us. So the priests, they were a part of what was called the Levitical priesthood. And there were many priests who worked to make offerings and sacrifices on behalf of the people. They served at the temple, but in the temple, there was a special inner place called the most holy place. And among all the priests, only the high priest was allowed into that space to make very special offerings on behalf of the people. And these offerings were all about dealing with Israel's sin and restoring their communion with God. And when Jesus showed up on the scene, he started kind of acting like a priest, forgiving people of their sin, restoring people who were impure so that they could enter the temple and worship God. But the problem is, Jesus, he wasn't part of the Levitical lineage, and he was doing his work outside of the authority of the priesthood. So you can sense how this created some tension between Jesus and the priests. And it raised questions for the people in that time. Who do we follow? Who do we trust? Who do we turn to? So with that in mind, we're going to turn now to Hebrews chapter 7. And I've asked for a few volunteers to help with some reading. So track along, it's on the screen. Let's hear from Hebrews 7.
There were many priests under the old system, for death prevented them from remaining in office. But because Jesus lives forever, his priesthood lasts forever. Therefore, he is able, once and forever, to save those who come to God through him. He lives forever to intercede with God on their behalf. He is the kind of high priest we need because he is holy and blameless, unstained by sin. He has been set apart from sinners and has been given the highest place of honor in heaven. Unlike those other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices every day. They did this for their own sins first, and then for the sins of the people. But Jesus did this once for all when he offered himself as the sacrifice for the people's sins.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So, if you didn't get the message, let me make it clear. The author is convinced that Jesus is superior over the Levitical priesthood. And if you're okay with it, if you don't mind, I'm just gonna get like a little bit geeky, all right? Now, if you know me, you know that my love language is spreadsheets. And so, I'm gonna use one to help us compare the ways that Jesus is presented as superior to the Levitical priest. Who else loves spreadsheets? Come on now, they run the world, let's go. Okay, so first off, number of priests in both systems. How many in the Levitical? Does anybody know the answer? How many priests? Many, like lots. Like, I don't know how many, like too many to count, right? Which compared to Jesus, we got one. How about the length of their service? How long did the high priest serve in the Levitical system? Does anybody know? Not too long. This is all short term, right? Because they died. But Jesus, his priesthood is eternal. he continues to function as our high priest right now. And what about qualifications? To become a Levitical priest, you needed to be a descendant of Aaron. Your family ancestry determined if you were suitable. But Jesus is qualified based on the fact that he is the Son of God. And I mean, come on now. We all like to be proud of our family background, right? But I mean, like, if you're the Son of God, like, you flex that. Am I right? Like, you nobody who's gonna top that. So, what about the quality of their service? Well, even the high priests, those most special priests, had to make sacrifices on their own behalf before they could make offerings on behalf of the people, because they were aware of their own weaknesses and brokenness. They needed to be made right with God in order to make things right for others. But Jesus is perfect in his ministry. You see, first off, Jesus is human. And Hebrews declares that he identifies with our human struggles. We don't have a high priest who is totally unlike us, who cannot relate with us in any way. No, he can perfectly empathize with our struggles, but at the same time, he's perfectly holy, completely sinless, no need to make sacrifices on his own behalf because he is able to enter into God's presence fully on our behalf. Now, when it comes to making a sacrifice, the Jewish priests, they offered animals and grains as sacrifices for sin, whereas Jesus offered himself as the ultimate sacrifice. And here we see that Jesus is not only our great high priest, he is the lamb who was slain. His sacrifice is worthy because he is worthy. And how often did these sacrifices need to happen? Well, the Levites, they had to keep making sacrifices regularly. Daily sacrifices, seasonal sacrifices, annual sacrifices. But Jesus, in his death on a cross, offered his life as a once-for-all sacrifice. And the reason the priests made those sacrifices so often is because they were limited in their effectiveness. The purity and forgiveness that they offered, it was temporary, and it only dealt with the surface reality of sin and impurity. But Jesus, the sacrifice that he makes, was ultimate. Jesus offers a permanent cleansing that penetrates down into the depths of our hearts. So the pastor who's writing this letter is convinced that Jesus is superior to the Jewish priesthood. He wants to make sure that his readers grasp the fullness of what Jesus accomplished with his death on a cross. And for those first century Jews, this was critical to grasp, to grapple with, because Jesus totally disrupted their entire religious system that they were used to. And for you and me, this might feel disconnected from our lives. You might hear this information almost like you're sitting in a religious studies class, right? Interesting information, cool spreadsheet, Curtis. Can I get a copy later? I know. But what does this have to do with our lives? But I'm convinced that the author of Hebrews would not allow for that kind of reading today, because a claim is being made, a declaration about the identity of Jesus Christ. And in our culture, in our time, all kinds of claims are made about God and spirituality. Even in our secular age, we are told all kinds of things about the secret to a fulfilled life. And we may not feel like, we're kind of navigating competing religious ideas vying for our attention, but there are claims being made about the secret to happiness, the pathway to reconciliation, the keys to a satisfied life. And amidst all those messages that we are all navigating, the claim of Hebrews declares boldly that there is a high priest who gave his life in order for all humanity to be restored with our Creator. He is the only one worthy. His sacrifice is the only sacrifice that offers the healing that you and I truly need. Are you listening? And the author of Hebrews wants us to grapple with the significance of this truth, because the claims that are in the sacrifice of Jesus, it says that an entire new relationship was being established between God and humanity. So let's have another reading. Try it now.
But now Jesus, our high priest, has been given a ministry that is far superior to the old priesthood. For he is the one who mediates us a far better covenant with God based on better promises. If the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no need for a second covenant to replace it. But when God found fault with the people, he said, quoting from the prophet Jeremiah, "The day is coming when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and Judah. This covenant will not be like the one I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand and led them out of the land of Egypt. They did not remain faithful to my covenant, so I turned them back on them, says the Lord. But this is the new covenant I will make with the people of Israel on that day, says the Lord. I will put my laws on their minds, and I will write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people."
Thank you. So, Hebrews says that the time has come for a new relationship between God and humanity. And the language of this new relationship is covenant. And covenant, it's not a word that we use a lot, but it is a word that carries a great significance. And our friends at the Bible Project, they do a fantastic job explaining the importance of covenant in the Bible. So I thought, why don't we see what they have to say? So let's turn our attention to the screen.
If you've been around Christians, you've probably heard of the idea of having a personal relationship with God, which could mean different things in the Bible, like having God as a friend, or your father, or maybe your teacher.
But there's one particular way that the Bible talks about this relationship that you find all over. But strangely, we don't talk about it that much. And that's the idea of a partnership with God.
A partnership like working alongside someone to accomplish a goal together.
Right, and this is actually what you see at the beginning of the Bible. God creates this good world full of all of this potential. And then God appoints these unique creatures, humans, as his partners in bringing more and more goodness out of all that potential.
But the humans don't want to partner with God. They rebel and try to create a world on their own terms.
And so this broken partnership is the Bible's explanation for why we're stuck in a world of corruption and injustice and the tragedy of death.
It's not like there's just one or two humans who have bailed on this relationship. In the story of the Bible, everyone has abandoned the partnership with God.
So what God does is select a smaller group of people out of the many, and he makes a new partnership with them called a covenant. And in a covenant, God makes promises, and then in exchange asks his partner to fulfill certain commitments. And the purpose of all of this is to somehow use this covenant relationship to renew his partnership with everybody else.
Now, there are actually 4 times in the Old Testament that we're told God initiates a covenant relationship with Noah, Abraham, the nation of Israel, and King David.
And it's through these that God is forming a covenant family into which all people will eventually be invited.
So let's see how these work. The first one is with Noah.
So in this story, God has just brought the flood to cleanse the world of humanity's corruption, and Noah and his family are the only ones left. And so God makes a covenant with Noah, saying, listen, I know that humans will continue to be evil, but despite that, I'm not going to destroy it like this again. Instead, the earth will be this reliable place for us to work together.
Great. So what does Noah have to do?
Nothing. And that's what's so interesting about this first covenant, is that God is promising to be faithful, even though he knows humans won't be.
The next time we see God make a covenant is with a man named Abraham. God chooses him, promises to bless him, give him a large family, lots of land where they can flourish.
And in return, God asks Abraham to trust him and train up his family to do what is right and just. And the whole reason for this covenant is God says that somehow he's going to bring his blessing to all families of the world through this one family.
So that's Abraham. The next time we see God make a covenant is when Abraham's family grows into the tribe of Israel.
And this covenant is with the whole tribe. God asks them to obey a set of laws, which are these guidelines for living well as a community of God's partners. And if they do this, then God promises to bless them and that they will become a people who then represent him to the rest of humanity.
That's the covenant with Israel. The last covenant is with King David.
Yeah, the tribe of Israel has become this large nation ruled by David. And God asked David and his descendants to partner with him by leading Israel in obeying the laws and doing what is right and just. And God promises that one day, one of David's sons will come and extend God's kingdom of peace and blessing over all the nations.
So those are the 4 covenants that God makes in order to restore his partnership with the whole world.
But here's what happens. Israel breaks the covenant. They worship other gods, they allow horrible injustice, and so they lose their land and are forced off into exile.
So it seems hopeless. But during this time, Israel's prophets talked about a day when God would restore these covenants in spite of Israel's failure, somehow.
Yeah, they called it the New Covenant. And this is actually what's so interesting about Jesus, is that he's introduced into this story as the one who fulfills all of these covenant relationships. We're told that he's from the family of Abraham, and so he will bring the blessings of that family to the whole world. We're told that he's the faithful Israelite who was able to truly obey the law. And we're told that he's the king from the line of David, and so he goes about extending God's kingdom of justice and peace to all.
And that's really remarkable for one guy.
Yeah, and what it highlights is perhaps the most surprising claim of all made about this man, that Jesus is no mere human, but rather God become human. And God did this in order to be that faithful covenant partner that we are all made to be, but have failed to be. And so through Jesus, God has opened up a way for anyone to be in a renewed partnership with him.
So Jesus calls people to follow him and become part of this new covenant family.
And despite their failures, Jesus is committed to making them into partners who are becoming more and more faithful.
The story of the Bible ends with a vision of a fully renewed world, full of goodness and peace.
And there's this renewed humanity there, partnering together with God to expand the goodness of his creation. And so the end of the Bible story is really a new beginning.
Very cool. Love the work of the Bible Project. So, this is the significance of Jesus serving as our great high priest. He has established a new covenant, a new partnership between God and humanity. And Israel had been looking forward to this new covenant for a long time. And even though some of the Jewish people were resistant to what Jesus represented, many recognized that this is where the story was always going to lead. The partnership between God and Israel, it was good, but it was incomplete. It depended too much on human commitments. And the story of God's people in the Bible is unfortunately riddled with all kinds of accounts of failure on the part of the people to be faithful to God and to trust God's promises. But the covenant that Jesus ushered in is secure because Jesus is the faithful covenant partner. Jesus has ushered in a new partnership on our behalf. And the hope of the covenant, it doesn't hinge on our ability to keep ourselves pure or to follow the laws correctly. No, the terms of this covenant, they actually penetrate deep beneath the surface. And this is what it means when it says that I will put my laws in their minds and I will write them on their hearts. Our partnership is not based on our abilities to follow the rules. No, our partnership is based on our hope that Christ himself is living within each of us. By his Spirit, Jesus dwells within us and transforms us from the inside out. So we're not trying to restore our relationship with God by doing the right things. Jesus has already opened up the way for each of us to have a restored partnership with God. Our access to that relationship simply depends on our willingness to trust and follow Jesus. Are you listening? So the pastor has made his case. Jesus is superior. He has ushered in a new, greater covenant. He's made his claim. This is who Jesus is. This is what Jesus has done. And now the question before his readers and the question before all of us is, what are we going to do about it? Let's have our last reading for the morning.
And so, dear brothers and sisters, we can boldly enter heaven's most holy place because of the blood of Jesus. By his death, Jesus opened a new and life-giving way through the curtain into the most holy place. And since we have a great high priest who rules over God's house, let us go right into the presence of God with sincere hearts, fully trusting him. For our guilty consciences have become sprinkled with Christ's blood to make us clean, and our bodies have been washed with pure water. Let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. And let us not neglect our meeting together, as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near.
Thanks. So, do you see who Jesus is? Do you grasp all that Jesus has done? Do you trust that his plans for you are good? Do you see how much he loves you? Do you know that his Holy Spirit lives within you? Are you listening? Friends, there is no claim that compares to this. Jesus is our high priest, and by his death and resurrection, he has declared that sin and evil have been defeated, and we can enter boldly into the most holy place with God. Our guilt is cleansed by Jesus. Our guilt is cleansed by Jesus, friends. Are we hearing this? We are forgiven. You are forgiven. And if you carry any sense of hesitation, if there's any burden on your shoulders, any angst in your guts over what you have done or what has been done to you, you need to know that you are cleaned, you are made pure, you are washed, you are deeply loved. And if we believe this truth, the challenge before us, the call to us, is to live into this story together. That's what church is. We are simply a gathering of people who have received the call to remain faithful to Jesus because Jesus is already faithful to us. Let's inspire one another to live well in response to what Jesus has done. We have nothing to earn, but we have every opportunity to embrace our calling as God's covenant partners in this world, to declare to our world, to display to our world what God is like, what God's love looks like. And I love how in this passage, the pastor is very pragmatic. There's a simple call, a challenge to us. Keep meeting together. Keep showing up for one another. We need to keep retelling the story to one another. We need to keep reminding each other of who Jesus is and all that Jesus has done. We need to share what we're learning, and we need to allow others to speak into the challenges that we are facing. We need each other if we are going to be faithful to God together. And that means we need to show up for each other. We need to gather. We need these kind of spaces where we can boldly enter the presence of God together. But we also need spaces where we can actually speak words of life to each other, where we can encourage each other. Because we are meant to be covenant partners with God together. We are meant to stir things up together. As my friend Jared Siebert likes to say, we are meant to get up to good trouble together. And that is why here at Lakeview, we emphasize things like home church. We need to actually hear from each other, not just the voices on stage. You need to be heard. You need to play your part of speaking into each other's lives. We need to do this for one another. That's what a healthy family looks like. That's what a healthy body looks like. So I encourage you to ponder this very clear challenge to keep showing up for each other, that we might fully enter into the life that Jesus has made possible for all of us together. A declaration has been made. If we believe it, let's live into it together.